Welcome to Soul Night Live, episode 104, The History of King Crimson, Part 2, 1975 to the present, with our co-hosts, Henry Potts and Aymeric Leroy. Gentlemen, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thanks. No, thanks for the invitation.
Well, I hope life has been treating you well since we last spoke.
Good.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to talk about the history of King Crimson once again. Our part one, which I will put a link to right here at this time if you'd like to watch it, covered the inception of the band up to its dissolution for the first time in 1974. So we're going to pick up there and refresh everyone's memories a bit about how it dissolved and why. And then we're going to talk about what happened through the rest of the 70s and talk about getting back together in the early 80s and becoming a band called Discipline, which we'll get to in a few minutes here, which became King Crimson once again. So, fill us in a bit on the reasons that the Lark's Tongue, the Red Era lineup dissolved and Crimson was no more.
Well, it was really down to a personal feeling by Robert Fripp, because he was certainly the only member of that band who wished to stop. I mean, Wetton and Bruford were also continuing for possibly years because they felt they were on the verge of really becoming commercially successful while still being very adventurous and inspired. So it was Fripp's decision. It was a personal thing about being tired of the rock and roll way of life. He thought it exhausted its potential as an education for a young adult. I think that's mostly what he said. And he decided to retire for a year in an institution, a Gurdjieff-related institution, where he spent a year living a very austere life and sort of regenerating his brain. Fripp was friendly with a disciple of Gurdjieff called J.G. Bennett, who founded this institution where he retired for a year. And Bennett, I think, died shortly before that, possibly in 73, 74. But it formed this place where people would receive a different kind of education. So he felt an urge to retire from the rock and roll scene for a while, and he only returned to it when Peter Gabriel invited him to work on his album and then touring. So around 76, 77, he re-emerged from this.
Would this be Peter's second album?
The first album, actually. He was involved as a session player, and then he went on to produce the second album. But the first was a Bob Ezrin production. He was just a player among many, as was Tony Levin. So that was the first meeting with Tony Levin, who, of course, would become for quite a long time an essential part of King Crimson. So meanwhile, Wetton and Bruford went on to various projects, the most striking of which was UK, which some took to be a sort of revival of Crimson.
Might be a good time to share our little slideshow here.
So UK begins as a planned King Crimson revival with it's going to be Wetton, Bruford, Fripp and Eddie Jobson.
Around 76, 77. That's actually during the Peter Gabriel tour that the possibility is discussed, and then Fripp decides not to become involved. Mostly, I think, because at the time he was moving to the USA anyway, and he didn't feel it would be practical. And I think he had reservations about reviving Crimson as sort of a backward step for him. And of course, he went on to do Exposure, solo album, in the month and years that followed, which was still quite Crimson-y, but also embraced some of the new musical inspirations from America and the post-punk era and the new wave and everything.
Would you agree that there are a couple albums that kind of point towards where Crimson would go once it resumed?
I don't know that UK is one of those. UK points to where Crimson has been. I love UK. I think UK were a fantastic sort of culmination of 70s prog at the end of the decade. And there's a lot of continuity, I feel, between the 72-4 Crimson Band and what we get in UK. But it's Fripp's material that, like Exposure, that perhaps begins to point to where King Crimson was to go next.
I don't personally see much continuity between King Crimson 74 and UK, apart from the sound and very unique playing of Wetton and Bruford. I mean, I think the sound is the most common trait. I don't think it's very Crimson-y at its core, and I think what it brings that is kind of new is the jazz rock influence from Bruford and Holdsworth. And I don't think ultimately it's really a pointer to anything that King Crimson did in the 80s, because Bruford's contribution is being Bill Bruford with all his weird time signatures and stuff, and that's always going to be in anything Bruford does. So of course, yeah, it's a Crimson related, very strongly Crimson related project, but I don't hear it as very Crimson-y intrinsically.
Yeah, I would say if anything, it looks back towards some of the symphonic touches that were on early Crimson rather than anything they did in the 80s. You know, there's some really nice kind of
certainly British
washes of strings that could be mellotrons, but were probably something a little more modern at that point.
Yeah.
But it evokes a similar kind of lushness, I guess I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Forget the tune, maybe 30 Years or one of those, where it's just almost reminds me of the Court of the Crimson King when it comes to the kind of just the symphonic synth kind of string that were used on that. So you had mentioned Exposure, and hold on a minute. There it is. And now this one I think does bridge the gap pretty well between 70s Crimson and 80s Crimson. Can you elaborate a bit on the making of this record?
Even the look of the album cover, you know, it looks like an 80s album cover. It looks like a new wave album. It doesn't look like a prog album in the way that many 70s albums do. Although we're still, of course, we're not quite at the 80s yet.
This is true. And would you say that Robert's flirtations with Blondie and the Talking Heads informed this record on some level?
Yeah, but I mean, to say that it is purely of this type would be to underestimate the Crimson heritage in it, which is quite strong, I think. Things like Breathless and a couple of other tunes really sound like Sons of Red to a large extent. And so the guitar parts are very Crimson-y sounding, and it's got Tony Levin on bass throughout. It's got several drummers playing with Phil Collins, Narada, Michael Walden, and Jerry Marotta, so quite different approaches, but parts of it sound really Crimson-y and others don't. There's a punky edge, especially to some of the material sung by Peter Hamill or even Daryl Hall. You Burn Me Up, I'm a Cigarette. It's really a punk song. So it's a mixture of things. And of course, there's echoes of the project that Fripp was involved in as a producer. So there's basically a solo Peter Gabriel track, which is great. I mean, Here Comes the Flood. It's a very beautiful song, but it sounds a bit out of place on the Fripp album, because all he contributes to it is Frippatronics. And there's a few things like that. The whole Daryl Hall collaboration thing is also related to the album Fripp was producing for Daryl Hall, which ended up being released a few years later.
Yeah, Sacred Songs.
Indeed.
Yeah, which is kind of tied with Exposure and Peter Gabriel's Scratch album. as kind of a trilogy of sorts, an unlikely trilogy. And yeah, some of the music does, there are connections, like the title track, Exposure. It's like, where did that start first, here or on Peter's record?
I'm not sure. I think this was mostly, this was recorded 77, 78. It took a long time to be released, precisely because Daryl Hall's label wouldn't have him appear on more than 3 tracks if he wasn't a co-author of the album. So Fripp refused, and that's why he replaced some of the singing by Peter Hamill, and he used also ambient recordings like the My House, Your House tape. I mean, it was a taping of a couple arguing in the flat next door. So it took a while for the album to be released. So I think most of it was finished by the time he did the second Peter Gabriel album.
Now, was that another track that kind of wound up on 2 records? The New York, what is it, NYC? It's, you know, the My House. It's like, it has the screaming couple, the neighbors, on Fripp's album, but on Daryl's, you know, of course, he sings on it. Is that the same tune, or is it just
I don't think it's on Daryl's album. Is it?
Maybe it's,
because I remember that we've had since then the versions of all the tracks that Daryl was prevented from singing on the album. We had the versions with Daryl on the later double CD re-release. So I'm not, I don't remember Sacred Songs as having a lot of things that sounded like Crimson, or
no, that's really the only track on it that has that really dissonant Crimson kind of rub to it. And it's interesting, they both have a New York theme, but I thinking now, I don't think they're exactly the same piece of music, but have a similar dissonant attitude that kind of makes them seem like they're siblings.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what happened after this, and how Crimson, or this group, they got it together with Tony Levin and Adrian Belew. He brought back Bruford and became a new band. They weren't trying to be King Crimson. They wanted to be a completely different thing. Am I right? Called Discipline.
Well, as I said, I think in closing in our discussion last time, it wasn't as clear cut as that. I think the Fripp was asked by EG Records, the label, to reform King Crimson in some way. And that's what they were going to do when Fripp called Bruford to do it. It was a reformation of King Crimson. It was presented as such to Bruford. And then they brought Adrian Belew in, and Tony Levin was auditioned along with a few other bass players. But Fripp initially didn't think Tony would be interested in committing himself to King Crimson. So it was a surprise for him when he turned up for the auditions in New York. And so that ended up being the band. And at that time, I think it was a decision on Fripp's part that is very typically his Gurdjieff influenced way of thinking, is that never to cater to expectations. So he wasn't quite ready to name the band King Crimson until he'd experienced the spirit of King Crimson, the good fairy, as he called it, to visit him. And that happened apparently during the rehearsals prior to the tour, which by then had been booked as a Discipline tour. But a few days before the tour happened, it was already decided by Fripp that it would be called King Crimson. So it did tour as Discipline, but
very convenient how the fairy turned up to tell him to do what his record label wanted and what would make more money.
Well, it's nice they were all on the same page.
So Jeff Berlin was suggested for the band, and
at Bruford's insistence, obviously, but he played far too many notes for Fripp to be interested. Tony's ability to play less, and the less is more kind of thing, is something that Fripp cherished, and he didn't like Berlin's approach. So that was only a couple of days auditions. There was an early version of Discipline that was posted from this rehearsal on the website. So we have a glimpse of what could have been.
With Jeff Berlin?
Yeah, with Jeff Berlin playing an early version of the track Discipline.
I'll have to look
I missed that.
Yeah, it's somewhere on
But the really important person was Adrian Belew. I mean, he's the person who transforms what this King Crimson will be.
Yeah, he's the front man, he's the main songwriter. Fripp writes, I would say, writes most of the instrumentals, and Belew, not all the songs, because I mean we're going to talk about the various tracks on the album, but Mate Kudasai sounds like, at first sight, first hearing, it would sound like something that Adrian Belew came up with, but it was the entire musical background to it was a Fripp composition from the band he did prior, between Exposure and the revived King Crimson, was the League of Gentlemen, and that was music he composed probably for it. There's sort of early versions of it also by the League of Gentlemen.
Yeah, I would say that album points to this more than anything on Exposure. You know, these little arpeggio ideas that became interlocking arpeggios on this record. There's a lot of those on the League of Gentlemen album, played over rather danceable beats. I guess that was the intent of that particular group.
Yeah, and some of it also involved David Byrne, so there's the Talking Heads connection as well, which is one of the bands that Belew was in before King Crimson. So perhaps we could talk about what Belew did before Crimson, because it's
so Belew had been in Talking Heads, although we're not always comfortable relationship in terms of what his role was. He'd done Jean-Michel Jarre by this time.
The which one?
Jean-Michel Jarre. Jean-Michel Jarre.
Jean-Michel Jarre.
Yeah.
Oh, that's Zuluk, but that's like in 83, 85 or something, right?
Oh, that's later. Okay.
Yeah. So the first thing was Zappa, really. I mean, it's funny that the one thing I didn't get was the French name, Jean-Michel Jarre, the famed synthesizer man from France. So yeah, Zappa was where Belew was first heard by many people, along with Terry Bozzio. Terry Bozzio at the time.
The Shake Your Booty album,
Shake Your Booty,
which
indeed.
was mostly live, actually.
Yeah, and then there was a strange trajectory, because he ended up, during the Heroes tour by David Bowie, basically replacing Fripp. So that's how I think Fripp first heard him, because Fripp was in Berlin and went to a Bowie concert. And that's when he first saw him, and so he wanted him in the band. And Belew at the time had a band, I can't remember the name, but he had a trio, which ended up being the group on his Lone Rhino album. Basically the same guys, but they opened for part of the League of Gentlemen US tour in 1980. So they had a close relationship by then, and I guess that's when Fripp decided, I want this guy to be in my group. And in the meantime, he went to Talking Heads and did a tour with them.
Yeah, he was on the Remain in Light album, which is one of their greatest. And ironically, he's out there now playing that album live with Jerry Harrison.
Yeah,
and a fine young group that's backing them up with a name that starts with a T that I can't remember, would probably mispronounce right now, but look up the footage. It's pretty stunning stuff, and I really hope that this lineup gets a chance to tour and let us all get a dose of it in person, because that music is pretty timeless, and you know, the Talking Heads haven't been a thing for a long time, so it would be a real treat to see that live.
Yeah, and Talking Heads' influence was quite, I mean, a lot of people thought Belew's contribution to the new King Crimson had a lot to do with Talking Heads music, and his vocal delivery on stuff like Elephant Talk was often compared to David Byrne. So there's certainly an influence of American avant rock or new wave at the time. And that's the main characteristic of this new King Crimson is that it's half American, half British. So it's really quite a new thing for Crimson, and it's really felt in the music, which itself is half British, half American, I think.
It's also an album that does what King Crimson always used to do, which is not do what it always used to do. It is very much a change in sound, just as Lark's Tongues and Aspic had been a change in sound, just as In the Court of the Crimson King had been a revolutionary new sound. While the King Crimson name, I think, must have been commercially a lot more valuable, listening to Discipline, you don't think this is King Crimson or this is like old King Crimson. This is very much a revolutionary new version of the band. And live, they weren't playing old King Crimson tracks as had been their tradition, just as the 72 band didn't look back to earlier lineups for their live set list.
They did play a couple of tracks which are Red and Lark's Tongues and Aspic Part 2, which remained in the set list for many years after that. But the question of how, of whether this was King Crimson or not, is the question to ask is really, what would King Crimson have done in the meantime? I mean, between 74 and 81, had it kept on going, would it have come to the point where Discipline resumed things in 81? Or because King Crimson, as you said, was always evolving anyway. So was it destined to play this music anyway, or was it?
Well, I think it was King Crimson precisely because it didn't stick to the past. It did continue the tradition of not sticking to any one tradition.
I agree.
But it's more of a clean break from tradition than any previous album was. So I'm wondering if it's related to the time that's passed, the fact that there's two Americans in the band now, and of course Adrian Belew being a very, I mean, no one in previous lineups had contributed creatively as much as he did. It was always Fripp treating people's contributions and sort of making them Crimson-like, whereas Adrian Belew had more of a personal contribution as a co-leader almost from a songwriting point of view.
I agree. Well, I think their pairing was an inspired one because they both had less than typical approaches to guitar. It's almost like they were kindred spirits that finally met and teamed up. I think of them like two mad scientists in the laboratory cooking up these amazing guitar tones that maybe no one had heard before. And Robert finally found someone he could bounce ideas off of and be a team with. And I can't imagine anybody being a better match. You know, their styles are quite different, but they both had a kind of cutting edge quality to them that was very much in the spirit of King Crimson at the time, you know.
That's what makes this album such a good album, the way that these two very different but both experimental guitar styles meshed on Discipline, that you have this music that you can feel is very much coming from Fripp and has that link back to King Crimson's past, but it has this other side from Belew, which in some ways is more traditional songwriting, but in other ways is also doing very different things with the guitar.
Very true. New approaches that hadn't really been used much by Fripp previously, the interlocking arpeggios and such, the gamelan inspired. Can you talk a little bit about what gamelan music is and how it kind of inspired this new approach? Well, it comes from the east,
from India,
from Java, from Indonesia.
Yeah, Indonesia.
So Fripp banned, if I remember correctly, banned playing chords. That was his sort of big idea for the album. So it is all things like interlocking arpeggios.
Yeah, which was definitely something that no rock band had done before. Not like this.
And with the added Crimson thing of making Belew and Fripp play in different time signatures, so their parts sort of went in and out of synchronicity with each other. So there was an interesting thing there going on. So there was the cerebral English thing added to the to that sort of world music approach, again crimsonizing it and taking various elements of the new, I mean, both the world music and the New York downtown scene at the time, and making them part of King Crimson.
Yeah.
So as you said, I think the guitars was the obvious meeting point between Fripp and Bellew. It was the sort of core of the new band that made it coherent. But at the same time, they brought very different approaches to the band, including as a live act, because Fripp was sitting on his stool playing his very complicated parts, and Bellew was the front man entertaining the audience, which also was completely unseen in King Crimson. I mean, John Wetton didn't do that. He didn't speak to the audience ever. It was, at the time, Fripp occasionally said a few things, but Bellew was more traditional frontman. So it's quite a different band in this respect.
Very true. Another thing I think we should point out is the approach to instrumentation. That's another thing that really makes this album seem fresh, at least at the time. You know, they're all using instruments that maybe hadn't been used a lot in a rock context or at all because they were new. Bruford with his electronic Simmons drums, Tony Levin with the Chapman stick, you know, playing the touch patterns that are so much a big part of this era. Fripp and Bellew both using the Roland guitar synthesizers with that kind of fluty patch sound that Pat Metheny has continued to use for decades, that he loves so much. And it was a particular guitar that you've seen them. They look kind of like a Gibson SG, but they're brown, and really a pretty well-built guitar. But that was the thing back then with the guitar synthesizer. Like, these were some of the first guitar synthesizers that were ever used, and you had to use the guitar that came with it. So that's why you see a lot of footage of them playing these kind of brown looking SG instruments back then, especially Fripp. Adrian would use the Stratocaster more often than not, but there's certain songs like I think like The Sheltering Sky where they both used the synths together. So the palette was totally fresh for this era.
Yeah, and Elephant Talk is a great opening track because it starts with a Chapman stick. It's a completely new sound. But once Bruford comes in with the drumming, you get the Crimson vibe, but with a new kind of groove. It's very groove orientated, and the singing is like nothing you've heard before in King Crimson. But between Fripp and Bruford, you've got enough Crimson tradition to feel at home, kind of, in the context of something that is otherwise really, really different.
I would agree. And, you know, there are certain songs on here that do kind of look back to a more of a Red kind of palette. I would say Indiscipline's probably the most obvious one when it gets going, and it's really, really kind of mean and menacing and heavy. So there's a bit of that on here, but, you know, other tracks like the title track, it's all about these, you know, crystalline arpeggios played with. Another thing to point out is the invention of an effect called chorus that came along in the late 70s that kind of added kind of a lushness and a kind of a third dimension to guitar tones, and it became part and parcel of the 80s across the board. You know, originally it was only available in an amp from Roland, the Roland Jazz Chorus, same people that made the guitar synths, and that just suddenly you hear it on everybody's recording starting around 1977 or so. And back then, the only way you could get that effect is to buy their amp. But soon it was available in a little guitar pedal that anyone could use, and you just hear it on every 80s album pretty much, you know. And it was a very kind of pretty sound, I guess, kind of little girly in a way. So yeah, that's just a fresh palette going on here that really.
And Sean, as a guitarist, how impressed are you with Bellew's Elephant thing on the guitar? Is it hard to achieve?
I don't know how he does it, honestly. But yes, and I think that's one of the hallmarks of his style is making these unguitarish sounding sounds out of the guitar, And I think Fripp, to a lesser degree, managed to do that occasionally too. And I love people of that mindset that it doesn't sound like a guitar, but it is a guitar. I think that's a very valid approach, and I wish more people would do it. It kind of leans into the textural world of guitar playing that people like Andy Summers did. And again, there's kind of a connection. Andy Summers and Fripp did those albums together during this time period, Bewitched and I Advanced Masked. And I'd say that those are a good sidebar to this particular time period.
But in Baloo's case, it's also part of his entertainer approach.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Well, he's kind of like,
it makes it really fun to watch and listen to.
well,
as well
in
as being
Zappa,
musical.
that chair was kind of called the stunt guitarist, and I think Adrian was probably the first one. And yeah, he does seem like a stunt man on the guitar in a way. So it's all quite entertaining. It's the whole package. It definitely gave this lineup a totally different personality. So yeah, revolutionary record. I still think it stands as one of their greatest and most realized. I think in the future, there's only so many ways to reinvent the wheel, and obviously, as much as we want King Crimson to do that every time, that really wasn't possible. Although I think there are certain tracks on future albums that do go new places. A lot of people would be quick to say that the three records from this lineup in the 80s all are similar and kind of remakes of Discipline, but I don't think that's totally true. I think each one of them goes some new places, actually. There are certain things like the interlocking guitars that kind of tie these three records together, but they're not on every song. Mm-hmm. So it kind of depends, So
I mean, I think Discipline is a great album, and if I wanted a quick summary of King Crimson, which these videos aren't, I'd say, you go from In the Court of the Crimson King to Discipline, and everything after that is footnotes. For me, this is the last time King Crimson made one of their great albums. And it's interesting that you have these two albums after Discipline, that the same group in the same time period. And instead of sort of growing, I think in some ways, people sometimes see the next two albums as less successful at doing what Discipline does, bringing together these disparate styles of Fripp and Baloo. In a way, the next two albums both failed to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think this album offered up a brand new world in a way, and I don't think there's anything wrong with reveling in that world for a couple more records.
Yeah, but they didn't really do it, and that's part of the issue with the next two albums, is that they weren't content with having come up with this new sound. They wanted to keep progressing, and there's a question of whether it had the potential to really keep reinventing itself with each new album. They really did try hard to bring something new to the table on the next two albums, but whether they delivered anything on that level or much on that level remains to be discussed, I think.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the Discipline tour? Any details? Were they playing on bills with other artists, or were they headlining?
I'm not sure they did. I mean, they did on the next tour with Roxy Music on the sort of Beats tour, but I think they were mostly playing on their own. I mean, the first tour, which was the Discipline tour, when they were touring as Discipline in England and France and perhaps other places, pre-recording the album. That was a sort of club tour. They played small clubs. So, of course, they were playing on their own, pretty short sets with minimal prior material. And then they went to the US and Japan in late 81, playing some new material as well. I think there were gigs in New York towards the end of the year. Was it the Savoy? I'm not sure what the venue was, but those were hailed in retrospect as possibly the peak of the new band, perhaps never to be bettered in a way. But we'll talk again about how Fripp was disappointed with what followed, and it was never as good as Discipline as far as he was concerned.
Well, I think it was consistently good, but it seemed like there was a certain magic and a kind of lightheartedness on this first tour that was gone later. It seems a little more workmanlike. Like, have you seen the footage from a late night TV show here in the States called Fridays?
I think it's on the reissue, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say that is hands down my favorite piece of Crimson 80s footage. It seems like it's a joyous occasion. They're happy to be together. Fripp is clowning and laughing and throwing in all these crazy atonal licks. Like they do a version of Elephant Talk and they do a version of Thela. And just the best footage period of this tour or that lineup, I think. It's like when you watch the footage of the Beat tour or the Three of the Perfect Pair tour, they get it done, but it just doesn't seem like they're enjoying each other's company.
Well, Fripp's heart wasn't in it anymore after the Beat album. I think we're going to talk about the Beat album.
Let's go ahead
Basically,
and talk about
it didn't go well during the recording, and every bit of touring after that was as little as Fripp could get away with doing. And the last tour in '84, they didn't even tour Europe or England. They toured the US quite minimally and Japan, and that was it. And of course Montreal as well. So yeah, there's certainly a case to be made that as far as Fripp was concerned, only the touring pre-Beat was really enjoyable.
So Beat has a poor reputation, I'd say, amongst King Crimson fans. I am always reminded I had an ex, and Beat was not just her favorite King Crimson album, it was one of her favorite albums of all time. So it worked for at least one person out there. But I think a lot of King Crimson fans do not view Beat favorably, and nor does Fripp himself. So the band get to recording the album. And there is this falling out towards the end of the recording between Ballou and Fripp. Ballou at one point tells Fripp to go home. Fripp disappears. Fripp says he was entirely absent from the mixing of the album, and that the band had effectively split up until tour dates came along. So there were tensions. Bruford seems to have been on the side of Ballou, but both Ballou and Bruford have latterly said that, Ballou has said that the making of the album was very unpleasant, and both Ballou and Bruford have said that in retrospect some of the material shouldn't have been on the album. So what we see on Beat, what we hear on Beat, is instead of this balance perhaps between the Fripp sound and the Ballou sound, is much more of the Ballou sound, with songs like Heartbeat being poppier.
Yeah, they're probably their most blatant stab at a pop song.
Yeah, I remember asking Ballou on the early sort of internet question and answer thing, whether he thought Heartbeat was the right song for King Crimson, and he said no, that he perhaps should never have given it to King Crimson, because in the end it wasn't really Crimson. It was sort of Ballou within the context of King Crimson. But overall, I mean, the issue really between Fripp and Ballou at that stage, I think, went back to the decision they made early on that everything would be credited to everyone. And after a while, Ballou was coming up with most of the sung material, certainly, and rightly felt that he was bringing most of the music that appealed to people. Fripp was bringing the sort of cerebral instrumental stuff that probably had little commercial potential on its own. And after a while, he felt he was doing most of the work writing-wise, and felt he wasn't rewarded enough for it. So that was part of what was contentious at the time between them. And then there were issues of a musical nature, really, was how to take the band forward. Fripp was apparently in favor of sticking to mostly the discipline set of recipes, like the interlocking guitars and that sort of approach, and felt it could be carried on into the next album. And what he said retrospectively on the Beat album is that at that time, people within the band felt inclined to return to their previous inclinations rather than stick to the new identity. In Belew's case, bringing songs that were pop songs and had very little Crimson about them. So that was, I think, his main gripe with what was going on at the time. And eventually the album was difficult to make because simply there wasn't that much material that was generated, certainly less than they expected to generate after such a brilliant start. They were very optimistic that they would write a second album without a problem, and they ended up with less than half an hour of material, and they had to record this improvisation called Requiem to fill out the album. So yeah, there was issue with the band's own creativity at that point.
And the album and Discipline before it did have some degree of commercial success. Discipline was well received by the critics, and they were selling quite well, better than I think 72 for King Crimson. Obviously, their former bandmate John Wetton was doing somewhat better commercially. John Wetton by this time was in Asia, who had the best-selling album of 1981 in the US.
82. Asia was in 82, so it was around the Beat period.
82,
rather than,
yes.
Yeah, so they were becoming really successful right when Crimson were recording Beat.
Sold better in 82 than Thriller.
Wow. That's a biggie.
Although Thriller was then the best-selling album, I think, of 83 and 84. So yeah, I don't know if anyone in King Crimson was looking at Asia as an example of what to do, but they had some success themselves, and Heartbeat I think did okay as a single.
Have you seen the video for Heartbeat?
Oh, a long time ago.
Look at
Yeah,
them.
well, I don't remember much.
They're all like in a nightclub chatting up some different girls, and it's kind of a corny, awkward video.
Oh, Fripp liked chatting up girls.
Well, we all do, but did it make for a great 80s video? No. But it's worth looking up.
So what we're seeing here on the screen is probably them playing Waiting Man, right?
Yeah, and I think
and Bellew did the dual Simmons drums things on the intro.
Yeah, I'd say the polyrhythms they got going between the two of them, this was something new. It was almost like the interlocking guitar idea taken and done with drums.
Yeah, and great visually as well. It was quite striking.
Yeah, so I'd say
as a live performance.
That was fresh. That was something kind of different for this record.
So, I mean, we're talking about sort of Bellew songs being more poppy, but they weren't very mainstream pop. Bellew's material still had a lot of quirkiness to it. There's still a lot of experimenting with rhythms going on.
Very true.
Yeah, after all, he was kicked out of his label for not being commercial enough a few years later. So he wasn't. Yeah, to characterize him as the commercial influence in King Crimson would be very wrong. But what he brought to Crimson was more pop influence than anyone else in the band could be. But he wasn't a strictly commercial artist, that's for sure.
I think this album stands on its own, though. It has its own personality. I think the opening track, Neil and Jack and Me, is probably the closest to a Discipline kind of track, thanks to the interlocking guitars. It's almost like Frame by Frame Part 2. But other tracks,
So the Jack in Neil and Jacome is Jack Kerouac.
Correct. Yeah, the beat poet.
And so Robert Fripp comes up with this idea for building on some ideas from Blue, of making the whole album themed around the beat poets and that period. And there's multiple references across the album.
Yeah, Sartori in Tangier, the instrumental being one, and the Howler is another reference, not to Kerouac but to another beat writer who wrote Howl, sorry, and of course the name Beat. So it's sort of a concept album. I'm not sure it works ultimately as a concept album because it's a packaging thing more than something really deep.
Yeah, it's not a concept that comes through, I think, very strongly.
No, it's pretty
in the material, although it's all apparent when it's pointed out.
But it's good to point out that, you know, at first you would probably just look at the title and think, oh, it's about rhythmic beats.
Yeah.
But really, that wasn't the genesis of that idea, although there are some really interesting rhythmic beats on this record. But yeah, Sartori, I think, is one of the coolest instrumentals from this era. And, you know, it kind of breaks from the rigidness of the interlocking thing, and it has a sort of freedom to it, you know. And I think,
yeah, because Ballou was playing second drums on that, wasn't he?
Yeah, and Fripp is just free to kind of shred it, and does beautifully. I particularly like the live version on the video from 1984. I think he almost falls off his stool. He's so excited. So, you know, he was enjoying it. So yeah, I think this album, it's not Discipline Part 2, no matter how much some people might want to paint it as such. It's different. And I'd say that's true for the next one as well, to a slightly lesser extent.
I think all three albums are obviously the same band. And is there less evolution across these three albums than there is, say, across Lark's Tongue, Starless, and Red? And they do each have their own character, but they are all clearly connected.
Well, as I said, I think they're trying really hard to create something new on those albums, and whether they succeed or fail is another matter. But as regards this album, there's clearly an attempt to keep pushing the envelope in terms of being more experimental as well as more commercial on some songs. But things like Industry are really quite left field, and they're keeping experimenting on like fretless guitars and more technology as well. But the thing about this album is that it took an awfully long time to create, because they took the whole of 1983 off and did several series of writing and recording sessions all through that year, and largely failed to generate new material until the very end of that process. So it was a long time in the making, and the band didn't perform live for a year and a half. So it seems like a very concentrated period of activity, 81 to 84. But within that, half of it was spent trying to make this third contractual obligation album. So from Fripp's point of view, it was a contractual obligation album, because he seems to have not to have enjoyed the genesis of the album very much.
Do you think that inspired the title? Almost like Beat and Discipline were the ones that were legit in his mind, and this was the third in an installment that really should have just been two?
Well, that's a Ballou lyric. I think the song existed before the notion that it would be a good album title came about. So I think it turned out really well, but I don't think it's a Fripp statement in any way.
But what we do see on the album, very noticeably, is this fracturing of these different styles. So to a degree, one side is your more poppy Ballou songs, and the other side is your more experimental improvisations being driven by Fripp.
And a nod to the past with the Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 3 as well. So that's a very unexpected.
I think that is the least loved of the Lark's Tongues.
Yeah, the only one they're not playing at the moment.
Right. I think it kind of deserves a modern rendering, honestly, because I don't know, the live version, or not the live version, but this is an interesting one. It opens with that cadenza that Fripp played in the middle of Lark's number one. That's basically the same lick, and then it goes into something kind of new. I think the hallmark of most Larks is there's kind of a scratchy sounding chord that pops up somewhere, usually to start it, like the one at the beginning of number two, and then once Fripp does his intro, there's another one in this as well. But this one, I think it starts strong, but it kind of peters out at the end, and I think that's probably its biggest shortcoming.
The cover, it has been claimed, is a reference to the Lark's Songs and Aspect cover.
Really?
A super stylized reference. So the crescent moon on Lark's Tongues, well, there's your blue crescent at the top. So it's sort of been flipped around. And the sun, the yellow sun, but maybe it's now coming in from the bottom.
Like the sun.
How much of a rumor and hearsay is that?
I'm not certain whether this is fan speculation or whether this has been confirmed by the band.
Yeah.
Well, this is the only album that inspired a bass. Tony Levin's famous "We Have a Perfect Pair" Music Man, which he even used on a recent Crimson tour after decades. He had it refurbished. I noticed he left it home this time, but it was an eye catcher for sure.
But I agree. I mean, I think the album runs out of steam. The instrumentals on the second half have a tendency to meander.
No Warning. I think that's one of the ones that's on there.
Yeah, not all of it is very pleasant listening.
I think the first side goes down pretty well, but side two takes more attention.
I mean, the title track, I think, is a classic.
Absolutely.
One of
the best interlocking pieces. And then there's other kind of quirky ones on there, Model Man and Man with an Open Heart, which I think are both really cool, quirky little tunes. But they are a little different than anything that had been on a previous Crimson album.
Yeah. Had Fripp adopted his new standard tuning? I seem to remember he sort of invented it around 83 or something. Was he already using it on this?
I don't think so. I think that all of these, because it's clear when you watch the live footage of this tour that he's playing in standard.
Okay.
So I think it probably took a few years to come to grips with. Maybe
that would have been really early.
10 years.
Yeah, for something that he invented the year before to already be in use on that album. So
yeah. So it's it's once they get back together in the 90s, it's there till this day. But I think he was still in standard for this. Sleepless, I think that's another tune we should talk about for a moment. It's kind of a love or hate kind of song for a lot of fans. Some people think it's just kind of their stab at sort of a 4 on the floor disco kind of tune. But Tony Levin's bass really makes that song.
That's a cool riff.
He's playing off the echoes. It's like it sounds like he's playing a lot of notes, but he's only playing about half as many as what you're hearing, because you're hearing the echo, the slap back of the digital delay that he's playing through.
Yeah, interestingly, there's a work in progress track from some of the early recording sessions where Larks 3 and Sleepless are actually the same piece. I mean, within the same. So they were separated at one point, but it was all part of jamming around stuff, and bits of ideas were repurposed to other tracks. So it's quite interesting to hear this early concoction.
So Henry, which is your favorite of these 3 records?
Oh, Discipline, I think, is straight out of the block. They get the formula right. and it has the strongest material from all of them, from all four of them.
How about you, Aymeric?
Well, I completely agree. That's exactly my take on it.
I would have to agree as well. Although I've got a lot of love for the other two records as well. They're interesting in their own right.
Well, it was a great band, that's for sure. And the live album they made right at the end in Montreal is a great summation of what they did over the 3 years. So
Absent Lovers.
Yeah. So it's
and Fripp, as he often does, has said the live album is the better representation of who they were.
How do you like those boots? Got a little bit of a Robin Hood thing going on there, Adrian.
But there were tensions in the band which I think hadn't been resolved from Beat, and they split up.
Yeah, I think Fripp couldn't wait for the tour to be over, and really he couldn't wait to break the band up and move on, because as I said, his heart wasn't into it any longer. And there was this notion that 3 years was enough. I mean, Crimson had sort of gone in 3-year cycles previously, and I guess it fitted his notion that everything could be cut down in 3-year cycles, like the incline to 81 or stuff like that he theorized before.
So lots, though, I think comes out of this band. Bruford and Levin now have this strong relationship. They've bonded, and they go on to work together on so many projects for years until Bruford retired.
Yeah, most notably the collaboration with Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe.
Well, so Bill Bruford is suckered into a Yes reunion by Another Name, thinking initially that it's just a John Anderson album, and he brings Tony Levin in as well. So we have.
I don't believe this, by the way. I don't believe he didn't know it was. I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Oh, that's the story.
Unless he was kept completely in the dark by Anderson. I mean, this whole story about being surprised to meet the band at the airport, I just don't buy it.
Bruford does sometimes exaggerate stories, I think.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to talk though about Ballou. I think Ballou then does some great solo albums, which carry forward very much what he's been doing in King Crimson.
Oh, very much. There's everything he did was pretty much quality, and this is true to this day. He has a new record coming out. It's called Pop Smart or something like that. I might get a chance to talk with them about that before long. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, he's a very creative guy, and is probably the one with the most consistent output over the years. I mean, he certainly seems to write more music than Fripp does.
No, absolutely.
And of course, at this point, it's when he guests with Jean-Michel Jarre.
Yeah, amongst other things.
Okay, there we go.
You did mention Bruford and Levin playing on the David Thorne album, Cloud About Mercury.
Oh, that's great.
So that's the precursor as well to the Blue project they did in the 90s.
Fantastic group, I think. I think the Blue group is like my favorite non-Crimson side project.
Yeah, I would say that too. Yeah.
So 10 years pass. What happens?
Not quite 10 years, actually. I mean, if you take into account what's happening in the background, as soon as 87, Fripp writes a new iteration of Lark's Tongues for a projected film music, which doesn't get made. But at that time, there was a possibility already that Crimson might reform. Then the whole David Sylvian thing, where initially Sylvian is approached to join the new version of King Crimson, which wouldn't have Ballou in it. So that's quite a what-if kind of situation. But Sylvian refuses. It doesn't want to be in King Crimson. So eventually that materializes as the Fripp Sylvian collaboration album. All this being undertaken while EG Records is collapsing under the weight of the misdeeds of its bosses. So in 81, the label goes bankrupt. It's sold to Virgin. And after a long spell of legal action, Fripp gets back all the rights to the Crimson back catalogue and forms Discipline Global Music, which is still his main outlet. And that's the context where King Crimson initially fails to resurrect, because all this is going on exactly at the time Fripp was planning its return in 91, sorry. And so there's various episodes there. In 82, there is talk of, it's not 92. Actually, sorry?
92.
92, sorry. There's talk of King Crimson reappearing under the guise of Fripp, Ballou, Levin, Gunn, Trey Gunn. We should talk about Trey Gunn a bit, and Jerry Marotta, because at the time Bruford is still contracted with EG Records and Fripp doesn't want anything to do with them. He's probably not so keen to work with Bruford. They've always had very on and off relationship. So there's talk of King Crimson that wouldn't include Bruford. So all that is going on, but
can I interject? I mean, I think in some ways this legal battle with EG, where Fripp gets the rights to the back catalogue, is almost more significant. I mean, how King Crimson and DGM would go on to pioneer the selling of music and the repackaging of a back catalogue. It's perhaps the greatest influence later King Crimson's had, and most bands never get to this position where they can control their back catalogue the way Fripp controls the King Crimson back catalogue. So I think it's a really significant move. It's really a very painful, difficult period for Fripp and takes up a huge amount of its
yeah, because I think him getting the rights back is 97 actually. So it took a good 5 years for him to get that. And also DGM at the start was also a label for other bands as well, which it ceased to be in the early 2000s. But like the California Guitar Trio and other bands were on the label.
DGM tries to be a real label in a sense and becomes a King Crimson boutique label. And
it's very much like the Beatles with Apple, actually. It started off the same way, and after a while they found they don't have the time to, I mean, they've got enough on their plate with their own projects not to be able to deal with other bands being on the label. So,
and I think, though, it also reflects a commercial reality that it's a lot harder to make money by selling these unknown new bands that DGM signed than it is to make money from the King Crimson back catalogue. And DGM becomes very good at making money from the King Crimson back catalogue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a league of angry wives out there whose husbands bought every box set for the past 20 years. So they're starting their own group.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually more like 30 years now.
30 years, you're right.
About the Great Deceiver box, that's the first big one. And
to jump ahead, I think Epitaph, it's sort of testing the water. It's 2 CDs, but you can send off for another 2.
Correct.
Which seems ridiculous these days. It seems so few discs in a big box set, but at the time it was like, ooh, 4 CDs. What, you know?
And refraining from having people buy really crappy sounding CDs, like they wouldn't put those 2 on the market because they sounded not good enough, which is something they,
to be fair,
argued.
They were live recordings of the original lineup from the late 60s, so pristine recording wasn't really part of the picture. If I remember correctly, the 2-disc version was the 2 that sounded the best,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
other
But if you
two
take
were the
the Larkstongs box, not everything sounds that bad actually, as far
yeah.
as live recordings go.
But yeah, I think that was kind of the first, The Great Deceiver was the first archival release and one of the biggies, that's pretty much just tons of stuff from the Lark's Tongues era. And then next was the Epitaph box, which let people hear the original lineup live, which was pretty stunning, honestly. That's, I think, a very important release.
And DGM really pioneered this concept of ever bigger box sets, to now where 14 discs seems normal.
Yeah, I'd hate to see the shipping cost on that.
And other bands, and they weren't the only band doing that, but I think they were at the forefront. And it's something that we take almost for granted now that aging rock bands put out 14 CD versions of their old albums.
Yeah, but there's a new factor now. I mean, it started with the Bob Dylan boxes, is that they have to release the entire session material to retain the rights to them. So that's why you get those 18 CD Bob Dylan boxes. And the last two, certainly the last Crimson box, the Crimson King anniversary box, was about that. And they've done that as downloads for the next two albums from 1970. So that factor also increased the number of CDs in the box, because now you have the entire sessions over multiple CDs.
That's a recent development, and so that's to do with the 50-year rule for European copyright, which doesn't apply in the US. But in Europe, the recording being 50 years old means no copyright anymore, so anyone could just release a recording of it. However, if you master it and do things to it, then that version, you in effect reset the clock on.
That makes sense. Well, I think one of the reasons that Crimson was able to do this archival deep dive for so many years is the fact that they were, a band that improvised. Like every night was a little different, at least.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Warner, who owned the Atlantic back catalogue, who owned the Yes back catalogue up to just before Union, put out the Progeny box set, which is 8 shows. I'm a big Yes fan, I love Progeny, but it's 8 very similar shows because that was the music Yes were playing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think Yes could ever do this to the same extent because there's too much redundancy in their catalog and set list.
So King Crimson's use of improvisation, I mean, a lot of the sets are the same, but there's enough improvisation for a lot of this older material. But yes.
Yeah, but we're talking strictly, though, of the 72 to 74 lineup, the only one that did complete improvisation.
True.
Because the previous lineups didn't. And it's the only one where it's really justified, apart from the projects, I guess, is the next set of performances.
Well, some of the next period, there would be bits of improvisation in the show, not as much, but
in which period?
Yeah.
The track period. So there's
it's just that one track because they stitched together the improv parts of the track piece. So it's not like really a continuous improvisation.
Yeah,
I honestly think that the next era, the Construction of Light, Power to Believe era, probably improvised more than any other except for the Lark's Tongue.
Yeah. If you take out the projects phase, but in terms of the band being called King Crimson, you're right. There was a lot of improv on that tour.
Our chronology is going all over the place.
Let's not get ahead of things.
Should we walk towards Thrax? So there's been rumors of David Sylvian being involved, Jerry Marotta being involved. We've got Trey Gunn has worked with Bob Fripp.
On Sunday All Over the World, which was his short-lived band with Toya.
At this point, he's married.
Yeah.
This is true. Now, let's talk a little bit about Fripp's Guitar Craft course, because I think it's important, because out of that came Trey Gunn, who was one of the star pupils, and the California Guitar Trio as well, which is, you know, not Crimson per se, but they are definitely on the family tree.
Yeah, so Fripp in around 85 started making those seminars, guitar seminars in Virginia. I think the first one was at a local sort of institution, another Gurdjieff related institution over there, who asked him to run a guitar course. That's how it started, and then it blossomed to various courses all over the world. In Europe, there was some in France, quite near where I am now, actually, which a friend of mine organized at the time. So it kept Fripp quite busy, and it became a performing thing as well with the League of Crafty Guitarists, which gave birth to a couple of albums and some touring as well. Although the touring happened right when EG was collapsing, and Fripp had to sell one of his most prized guitars to fund the deficit, the money that was missing from the tour as a result of EG collapsing. So around 1991, that ceased to be as well, and that's when he went into the Fripp-Sylvian collaboration, which was with Trey Gunn, Jerry Marotta on the album, replaced for the tour by one Pat Mastelotto, who appears at this point. So touring as the Fripp-Sylvian band, you've got most of the next incarnation of King Crimson, actually.
So there's this talk of Fripp, in effect, wanting a new King Crimson. He can't have Sylvian, but, you know, he wants Gunn, he wants Mastelotto. He's back talking to Ballou. And I'm not certain how clear this is, but, you know, is at one point the plan for just those four? Because what Bill Bruford seems to relate is that he sort of gets wind of this and more or less forces his way back into the band.
Well, what I think happened, if I remember correctly, is that he heard the thing about Marotta back in '92, and he called Fripp saying, I want to be part of this, but at this point, the idea of a King Crimson has to be relegated to a project for later because of the EG difficulties. So at this point, I think it's part of the plan that is going to be part of the new King Crimson. But before that, Fripp asks him to break all ties with EG. So that's when he breaks up the Earthworks band in '93 and frees himself of all ties to EG. And by early '94, he's ready to be involved in the non-EG tied incarnation of King Crimson. And that's when things start in earnest for the new band.
And we end up with this slightly unusual 6-piece band, because we get Tony Levin and Bill Bruford back from the 80s band. So we've got the entire 80s band, plus this extra rhythm section of Trey Gunn and Pat Mastelotto. And Fripp comes up with one of his wonderful pieces of story making. He starts talking about a double trio, that there's him, Gunn, Mastelotto versus Ballou, Bruford, Levin. And this double trio formation is the conception for the new band, as the conception for the 80s band had been no guitar chords. Yeah. I think this is, like most of Fripp's story making, somewhat made up after the fact. It seems to have been a way of sort of justifying where the band had ended up, and actually not very much of the music particularly is based around any sort of double trio in a meaningful sense. Bits of it are, but not very much. But this new band, to much applause from prog fans who by this time had gathered online in exciting online forums, we got a new Crimson, and they begin with Room, and then the EP, which we'll talk about, and then they come on to Thrack. And I love this period. You know, I think Thrack, which develops the ideas we first hear on the Room EP, is a great album. I really like that album. But also, for me, this is the first time that King Crimson reappears, and it doesn't break the mold. This isn't a discipline. This isn't a Lark, Stanton aspect. This isn't a In the Court of the Crimson King. This is a continuation of what we've heard before.
Well, a continuation of the 80s and the 70s. That's what's new about it, is that it brings back some of the elements of the 70s. There's bits of the middle section to either Thrack or Vroom is an unused bit from the original composition for Red. So there's material that sounds like a direct continuation of the 70s as well. So
that's true, you know, because it seems like in the 80s they didn't use that harmonic palette. You know, it's almost like Thrack picks up where Red left off in a lot.
Yeah, Fripp has very explicitly stated that there was a self-censorship going on in the 80s where he forbid himself to use some of the characteristic singularities
we call them musical tropes.
Yeah, that's a way of phrasing it. Yeah. So those are brought back, and by the time of the later construction of Light Album, he claims that everything was now open again, and there was no self-censorship going on. So there was still a bit of that going on, in that the interlocking guitars this time were banished.
Right, there were none on
except for when they played material from the 80s live, but on the album there's none.
Yeah, this is very much in the Red ballpark harmonically.
Yeah,
and the set list is paying more attention to the back catalogue than had been the case.
Well, you mean the 80s back catalog, because in terms of 70s music, they bring back the talking drum as a prelude to Lark Stonks Part 2, but that's along with Red, that's still the quota of 70s material. But since there's a lot of new material that sounds in that vein, the overall impression is that they're moving back to a more 70s inclined style, as well as, of course, being innovative as well. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate that either, because as you said, the double trio thing is a bit, perhaps it happens less than one wishes it did on the album. It's not quite as innovative and as fruitful as Fripp claims it is. But there's aspects of it that are interesting, and perhaps had they made a second album with that lineup, perhaps that would have been fully developed. It was still in its infancy at that point.
Well, they tried in a sense and failed.
Yeah, although perhaps live it was more convincing when applied to the entire set list. The double trio was more of a live phenomenon than it ever really happened on disc, because it was a bit of a cumbersome thing to record and rehearse and write music together, as became apparent in the Nashville '97 sessions, where at great expense very little was made and written and rehearsed. Yeah. So it was a great conceptual idea, but it was a far cry from the small, mobile, intelligent units that Fripp theorized in the 70s. So
I think there's two points I want to make at this juncture. One is we see the beginning of King Crimson's obsession with random capitalization and silly names. With Room, it has to all be in capitals, and Thrack Attack with the vowels in little letters, and which continues with the projects, which we'll come to. But also, I don't think we've talked enough about Garner and Mastalotto, two fantastic musicians. I mean, I do love Thrack, and I love Bruford and Levin and having them there, but Garner and Mastalotto are, had we a King Crimson with just Garner and Mastalotto on rhythm at this point, I think that would have been equally exciting. Gunn in particular, I think, is another one of these great figures that Fripp manages to find for the band.
Yeah, so he's one of the guys that joined his Guitarcraft seminars initially as a guitarist. And then Fripp started using him on his projects, and he became more of a Chapman stick and later touch guitar player, beginning with the, as I said, Sunday All Over the World band, the Robert Fripp String Quintet, which is basically the California guitar trio plus Fripp and Gunn. The Fripp and Sylvian project was initially a tour with just Fripp, Sylvian, and Gunn, just the three of them. So he became for a while, nearly 15 years, Fripp's closest associate, really. He was part of all the projects, which is the only one apart from Fripp to be in all the projects bands. So as you said, a very important guy in King Crimson for the best part of 10 years. And Mastelotto was more of an accident in terms of joining the Crimson family, because they needed a last-minute replacement for Jerry Marotta for the Fripp and Sylvian tour, and he auditioned, and he joined them at that point. And it was out of playing with him every night on that tour that Fripp decided he wanted to keep working with him. So, and he's still in the band.
Yeah, well, he was a big Crimson enthusiast his whole life. You know, he was the drummer with an 80s pop band called Mr. Mister. Mm-hmm. You probably remember their big hit, Broken Wings.
Yeah.
And intelligent, sophisticated 80s pop, which is always a good thing. So he was kind of a, you know, he was, I don't want to say a shoe-in, but he was a logical choice, even if they were unaware of his background initially.
Yeah, and of course the fact that he had to cohabit with Bruford, or that Bruford had to cohabit with him in the band, was a weird conceptual decision, but it ended up being quite stimulating creatively as a double drum unit.
Bruford wasn't keen on the whole idea of another drummer initially.
No, that wasn't his decision to have another drummer.
It took them a while to break bread.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that it sort of became Jamie Muir to Pat Mastelotto, it's a sort of inversion of the roles that they had back in '72 with Jamie Muir. He became the sort of crazy percussionist over Pat Mastelotto keeping the beat going. So that was interesting conceptually as well in the greater Crimson history.
Good. I think, you know, this was a pretty exciting era. You know, it might not have broke as much ground as previous ones, but yeah, I think it needed to happen, you know, and I think some of these live versions from this era are definitive. Like I think the Red they played was the best one ever. And I feel the same about Lark's Tongue #2 and Talking Drum. It might also have to do with the fact that I heard those before I heard the studio counterparts, which I thought sounded a little dusty and sedated in comparison.
They were a very good live band.
Yeah, there were some good songs as well. Dinosaur is a classic Crimson track. I like the Bellew ballads like
One Time,
and Walking on Air. That was a nice set closer as well.
Yeah, those are beautiful songs, kind of in the modest Kudasai vein. You know, People. That's an interesting kind of up-tempo, funk finger-driven pop song from Bellew in there.
Yeah, so it's a lengthy album by earlier standards. It's over 60 minutes long. And over that duration, there's quite a bit of ground covered. Walking on Air is a very simple pop song. And on the other extreme, you have stuff like Thrack and Vroom, which are like polyrhythmic, heavy instrumental stuff. So it's quite a rich selection of material.
Yeah, pretty evocative at the time, you know. And for me, I was only really familiar with 80s Crimson, so when I took this home and played it for the first time, I was quite stunned at the heaviness of it all, you know. And then, of course, that inspired me to go back and check out the 70s catalog. And it was like, oh, okay, now I get it. But at the time, it was just like, wow, this is like heavy metal, but intelligent. Smart metal, shall we call it?
It was heavy, and I think it was quite influential, that, and also the DGM label signing a number of bands. It felt like there was a whole stream of progressive rock at the time that was going to follow this direction.
Yeah, I think it inspired a whole new generation.
Yes, although all the ingredients of FAC, I think, aren't new. I mean, they are the ingredients from the 70s and the 80s band. So I don't see it as the same success as a discipline.
No, honestly, I think from this point forward with Crimson, it was more a matter of recycling things from the past, but giving them a modern edge, or maybe pushing them to new technical levels that they hadn't reached yet. As a matter of fact, I think the next era is all about that. I think some of the most intricate music ever is contained on the next two records. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the construction of light in particular, which isn't universally loved, but being a fan of the 70s Crimson, I find much to enjoy about the instrumental material in particular. All the intricate guitars and complex multi-section compositions like Fractured and Lark's 4 and that sort of stuff.
We'll elaborate.
Well, I'll be the one to disagree, because I just think the band after Thrack struggles to find a way forward. We'll get to the project shortly, but I think there's a lot of unsuccessful experimenting, and the most interesting bits of the band start leaving. We will come to a series of lineup changes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but where does it fail? Does it fail? My take is that it fails because a 6-piece isn't a practical forum for creating new music, and that's the failure of the Nashville '97 sessions. I don't think the band is intrinsically running out of ideas. I think it's just too heavy to carry around as a band, too expensive, so yeah, the reason for the failure to keep going as the double trio is a multi-factor.
I think I'm less positive about there still being the ideas in the band. But then I'm very down on the projects, which we need to continue the story though to get to the projects. So we have the double trio, they tour, we have live albums including Thrack Attack, this piecing together of all the improvs within Thrack into a single album.
Yeah. I think the Baboom album is an important one to point out as a excellent live document from this era.
Yeah. But then they have these Champagne Urbana sessions. What year is this?
May '97.
And they try and write material and don't really succeed. They do later release all of the material because this becomes the norm. Everything King Crimson ever does now becomes released in some form. And you can listen to them, and they're quite fun in places, but it's not crystallizing into a great album.
No, there's a few songs that show up on Blues Op Zop Tuwa album. That song "All Her Love Is Mine," and there's one other's How I Remember How to Forget. I think both of those were slated for the follow-up to Thrak had it materialize. So you can kind of get a little glimpse at what you might have got if you listen to Adrian's Op Zop album.
So we then get to the projects. So Bill Bruford suggests to Bob Fripp, hey, let's do some improv shows. And Bruford said, this wasn't some grand plan for King Crimson or anything. He just thought it'd be nice to do some improv shows with Fripp.
Just as a duo initially.
Yeah, as a duo. And Fripp says, oh, I want Trey Gunn on board. So Bruford thinks, well, then I'll have Tony Levin on board. And we get this conception of a short residency at the London Jazz Cafe near where I live, of this for doing improv shows. Now, Fripp then runs with this idea, and he starts talking about the projects, spelt with a KC in the middle, as this fractalization of King Crimson, that King Crimson as a sextet isn't managing to create new material. So let's split the band into a series of sub-bands who'll do their own thing. And he talks about them as being the research and development arm of King Crimson, and then this will somehow come together to produce a new King Crimson. And by and large, it doesn't. It doesn't actually. I mean, this is again Fripp with a wonderful story that doesn't necessarily accord with what actually happens. So the project one shows the book, but before they even happen, in fact, we then get project two, which is Fripp, Ballou on
V drums and Gunn.
Ballou not planned to be on drums, but they gather.
Yeah, it's a guitar trio originally. Yeah,
and Ballou's just had this delivery of these V drums, this new electronic drum kit, and Ballou has done some drumming before, and they go, "Yay! Let's do it this way." And so we have Fripp, Gunn, and Ballou on drums as project two. And that's not live at this point. But they released a set of improvisations, which I think aren't very good. I mean, they're okay, but
I don't find any of the projects to be particularly compelling. As a matter of fact, I found them rather tedious at times.
I saw one of the project one shows, and I think the weakest show I've seen Bill Bruford do, possibly. I didn't think they particularly gelled or broke new ground.
Yeah, so there were 4 different projects, am I right?
You're going to fly in with a defense of the projects here.
Well,
me? No, Sean.
Yeah, defend them, because I haven't got anything to offer in that department.
An interesting aspect of the projects that is not known widely is that Fripp's idea was the projects would be open to any past members of King Crimson who wished to be part of it, but none turned out to be interested. So that was a wider ranging concept in Fripp's mind. It was also around that time that there were still discussions going about reforming the original band for a Japanese tour, and that failed because at that point Fripp's relationship with Lake wasn't good enough anymore, and Fripp suggested doing it with Wetton instead, and MacDonald only wanted the original lineup. So that was all happening around this time when they also started doing those archive projects. So it turned out to be just the members of the double trio involved in those projects, but it could have been a wider ranging thing.
Remind us the makeup of lineups 3 and 4.
So 3 is Fripp, Gunn, and Mastalotto. And,
is it?
Yeah, I had to look it up.
Yeah.
So 3 is Fripp, Gunn, and Mastalotto, and 4 is Fripp, Gunn,
those guys
Levin,
plus Levin, yeah,
and Mastalotto, and they both do very short tours, improvising. And these, we do see a little bit of material from these does eventually carry over to The Return of King Crimson.
Yeah, Deception of the Thrush being the main track. There's an interesting bit of touring that goes on in Japan at that time with Project 2 and Blue. So you've got almost all the entire double trio touring, but as separate parts of the same evening of music.
And then so there were these 4 projects at the time, but this idea of the project label as a way of labeling King Crimson side projects remains, and so we'll come back to some other projects later. But out of this period of fractalization, a new King Crimson emerges.
Before we go there, which do you think is the best of the 4 projects, Henry?
I think some of the later projects like Project X and Crimson Project are very good. Okay. I'm not particularly a fan of any of the first 4. They're fine. They're not terrible. I can put Project 2 on the CD player and I'm not going to turn it off. But I think Projects 3 or 4 are the strongest.
Yeah, my vote's for 3. How about you, Aymeric?
Yeah, 3 or 4, perhaps 4, because it's a more complete band. But I agree that there's too much randomness involved in improv for it to sustain my interest. I mean, I like that approach as a part of what the Next Crimson offered in their gigs, like segments of 10, 15 minutes improvising in between written music. I like that approach as an ingredient of a more wider palette of music.
Yeah, just because there's the cat. I was hoping.
Yeah, we were missing
him. Big fan of variety.
Well, he's going to get his own show at this rate. I think that'd be a good idea.
So, I mean, I think there's plenty of acts that can do solid improvised shows, and I think there's an interesting sort of discussion to be had about what rock improvisation is as opposed to jazz improvisation. And Henry Cow had those discussions in the 1970s about the nature of how they should improvise, and there are other artists in the 90s who are trying to think of ways that you can have a rock improvisation that's perhaps different to a jazz improvisation. And of course, many of these musicians, Mastalotto has done a lot of improvised projects since, but I just don't think the projects 1 to 4 particularly worked.
Well, the nature of improv is such that, some nights are really inspired and others just aren't. Any group that's in that realm that is expected to come up with something fresh and inspiring every night, they try. But, I've seen people liken it to not getting your landing gear up some nights when you're trying to take flight. And I think that's very true. So it's almost like the nature of King Crimson releasing every single thing they've done. You're going to get a variety. And, I'd say maybe a third of it is really inspired and golden. And the rest is kind of, trying to get the landing gear up. But we're going to sell it all to you. Why not? You sort it out.
I think it's Fripp has at various times in his career, he's come forth with ideas for a new musical direction, a different way of doing music, a different style within King Crimson and beyond King Crimson. But from this period onwards, his ideas seem to be less often about how they're doing the music and more simply, I'll have this combination of players. So the idea of the double trio without perhaps working out well, what does that mean musically as strongly? Or oh, well, we'll do Project 2 because Blue's on drums, without perhaps thinking, well, what does this mean for the music? And I think Fripp's musical innovations, even the new standard tuning, or what he was trying to achieve on Discipline, or what he was trying to achieve on Last Tongues, or even what he was trying to achieve with the trilogy of the Peter Gabriel, the Darrell Hall album, and Exposure, I think are stronger ideas than, perhaps better thought through ideas than what we get here with his idea for fractalizations, where you've got a band that's not coming up with good material, and then you split them into smaller units who still don't come up with good material.
Yeah, I think the issue may be that those ideas initially are quite spontaneous, in that Fripp trusts his muse to some extent, but then tries to intellectualize, conceptualize his very spontaneous ideas into things that don't necessarily convince conceptually. And there's a big gap between how prosaic some of these ideas are, like the sextet doesn't work, let's make smaller units. It's a very simple idea and one that makes sense, but when it starts to be theorized into, oh, let's make projects, and this is gonna generate some new, it's a bit pompous, and eventually he gets rightly criticized for being a bit pompous about what is initially a very simple idea.
Yeah, I can't say that it bore much fruit, but your mileage may vary, and I'm sure it will. Well, moving ahead, eventually they do settle on a 4-piece with Mastelotto and Gunn. And I think at the time, some of us were a little disappointed to hear that the double trio wasn't going to go forward, and we kind of wondered, how good could these new guys be compared to Tony and Bill? Well, in hindsight, the answer is quite good, and probably more inspired than Tony and Bill would have been at this juncture anyway.
So why do Tony and Bill leave? So Tony's busy with other projects, but not against.
Wasn't he with Seal,
I think
around the time?
Yeah, he has a Seal tour coming up, which eventually doesn't take place, I think, but that makes him unavailable for the next period that Fripp has set aside. And Bruford leaves, but not, as he claims in his autobiography, after the Champaign-Urbana or Nashville session. No, it's Nashville, really. Nashville sessions. He actually stays on as a theoretical member until '99, where Fripp says, I'm gonna go very electronic, very computer with that next incarnation. And Bruford, who'd been a pioneer of electronic drums at that time, was making the opposite, taking the opposite path towards acoustic drums entirely again. And so Bruford wasn't interested in this new direction. So he left. Tony Levin couldn't be involved, but would be returning eventually, which Bruford clearly was not. And so it amounted to this double duo, as it's another of Fripp's debatable concepts for the band. I'm not sure I even understand what the double duo is supposed to be. Double trio, it kind of makes sense. Double duo, I don't even know who is in the duo. But yeah, so that's the quartet. And it's a purely studio thing at the start. They don't play any of this material live before it's recorded, which is felt on the album a bit. It's a bit claustrophobic and a bit too electronic, because they recorded it in Adrian Belew's home studio, where they didn't have room for a proper drum kit. And so Pat ends up using the V drums exclusively, which is why 20 years later, he redoes the drums and we get the Construction of Light revisited that we got on the latest box set, the Reconstruction of Light. Yeah. So that's one aspect that I don't really like about the album is the drum sounds. And I think those tracks sound much better on the next tour, where Pat has a more wide-ranging kit.
I agree.
I'm going to disagree with Sean. I just don't think the material's so good. There is also Project X, though, which is exactly the same band, but with I think Gunnar Massalotto sort of given more control, who sort of do this remix album called Heaven and Earth. A great name for an album that, yes, you feel many years later.
Yeah, not to be confused with the Amazing Yes album of the same.
No, not at all. But I prefer the Heaven and Earth version of Construction of Light. I mean, I would happily have had Gunnar Massalotto being given more power to sort of lead the way, and that version I think is sort of going further down the route of electronic manipulation in a sense.
I do like the instrumental material on that album. I think people are criticizing it partly because Fripp made the mistake of calling those tracks Fractured and Larkstone Dynastic Part 4, and it really makes them sound more past orientated than they would have seemed had he named them otherwise. But I think as far as Crimson style instrumentals go, I think there's quite a lot of substance there. So I do really like Fractured and Construction of Light as well, and Larks 4. I think there's quite a bit of substance between those three tracks. I'm less fond of the Bellew neo-psychedelic things, and certainly not the Prozac blues. That's a painful listen for me.
That's a low point in the catalog for sure.
Yeah.
And I'm sure somebody will pipe up and go, I love that. That's my favorite song. Well, good for you. Every song needs love, so Yeah.
But you were mentioning Trey Gunn, and I think he proves on this album that he's a technical monster, basically.
Absolutely.
In purely technical terms, he's well above Tony Levin.
Yeah, I think Trey and Pat both put any doubts to rest once this tour happened. And it was just like, wow, these guys have fresh energy. They got fresh ideas, chops galore. Because I think that's what this album's about. It's taking the previous palette and trying to get more technical with it.
It was the time of new metal as well.
Absolutely.
It's a very, very heavy album.
This whole era is like that. I have likened it to the guitar cyborg era because it's just these big menacing riffs, and that's great because I think that's an important part of King Crimson. I'm really glad that that's part of this, and it was kind of like, let's see how technical we can go. I think was kind of the MO for this particular record, whether it was planned in advance or not, I don't know.
I was thinking, to go off on a slight tangent, of how the early King Crimson, the very first lineup, used to play Holst's Mars live, and wanted to do that on the record but couldn't, and replace that with a studio composition which is somewhat similar. And in many ways, it's the band being very honest about their influences, because you go back and listen to Mars. I mean, it's obviously a hugely overplayed piece that you hear all over the place. But the heaviness of Mars, of Holst, is such a defining feature of a lot of King Crimson, but you can trace its roots back to be before the band. And so, that heaviness is, I think, an important part of King Crimson. That Holst influence, I'm going to call it. But for me, on Construction of Light, it just, at times, it feels like it's being heavy for the sake of being heavy.
They're probably trying to impress a younger audience and be part of that Nine Inch Nails, math rock, Tool kind of audience. Appeal to that younger audience. And Fripp on the next album was going to call it new metal or something, as a very self-aware nod to the younger audience. So yes, perhaps he's eyeing that audience a bit too. And
I think Tool are doing, in some ways, more interesting stuff at the time. They're, you know, Tool are heavy, but
well, you
have some
know,
wonderful, interesting technical playing and melodies as well.
you know,
And Sean Malone on bass is fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, you know, metal had evolved a lot over the past couple decades. You know, what was heavy in 1974 was pretty quaint by the 1994. You know, and I think this album just gets up to date when it comes to what was considered heavy by this point. But in hindsight, I felt like this album was a hard nut to crack initially, and it was rather claustrophobic and difficult to listen to from beginning to end. I always had to tap out about halfway through it and try the rest later.
And Fripp doesn't seem that happy with it either.
Well, I think he's probably happy with the remake that they did. I think his main gripe with it was the fact that the material wasn't road tested and that they had to make do with those not ideal studio conditions. Man. But I think it was pretty happy with.
I don't think it really ticks all the boxes that you want to tick for a perfect King Crimson record.
Oh yeah,
it's kind of heavy on the really heavy, intricate things, and there are missing the cerebral side of King Crimson that's so important. And I feel like the next album, they got the balance just right. Honestly, I feel like that's a more concise album that hangs together better as a statement, rather than this one just seems like a collection of songs that don't really have much to do with each other, but are, you know, learn to live together.
Mm-hmm.
So did you see this tour, either one of you?
No, I missed it because I was in the States and I caught Yes on the Masterworks tour, and Crimson were playing, and the Nearfest I went also. So I missed Crimson, who were playing in Paris right at that time. So I saw the next tour, not this one.
Well, I actually saw the debut of this lineup at a little club in Nashville called 12th and Porter. Yeah. And the place was packed. There's probably only 200 people in there. And it was good, but they actually did a similar show before The Power to Believe that I enjoyed a lot more. We actually saw them debut a lot of the songs from that album instrumentally.
Yeah.
And it was, I was smart enough to get there early so I could actually get in the front row and see what was going on. Unlike when I saw this lineup, the debut, you know, I was like at the back, kind of craning my neck trying to see. So, but this is the era that I'm probably the most familiar with. I wish I would have started to go and seeing them back in the 90s. I would have loved to have seen the double trio, but it was not to be. So this is kind of the era that I was most plugged into, and enjoyed a great deal of it. Live, this lineup had the kind of agility and unpredictable quality that I think makes some of the best Crimson lineups so awesome.
Yeah, and as you said, they played a substantial amount of improv per gig. So there's of course, quite a lot of it has been released now, and there's quite a substantial amount of live improvisation from that tour.
The Heavy Construction live album that followed this is probably a great place to check out a lot of these songs.
Yeah, absolutely. There's better versions of these songs than on the album, actually.
Absolutely, yeah. So what happened between this and the next record?
Well, you told us they toured some of early incarnations of that material starting in 2001, and recorded the album the next year and released it the next year.
Again, with an EP taster as Room had predicted track. We had Level 5.
It's true, which has become Lark's Tongue's number 5 for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, recently though. At that time, it was Level 5.
Right. It's like, do you think they knew they were making Lark's 5 and just were tired of calling it that and called it Level 5?
Yeah, I think it was a reaction to the criticism they got from Fripp got for the previous album, calling the song Fractured, and he said there's going to be less prejudice towards the material if I call it something that doesn't really bring to mind old stuff. So
well,
I mean, I've never suspected, to be honest, I never suspected it was meant to be Lark Song 5 until recently when they started writing that on set lists.
Yeah, I don't really feel like it got the Lark's gene like the other four do.
Yeah, it's not that obvious.
There's no scratchy chord in it. So anyhow, they managed to do another album, The Power to Believe. I don't know if they were kind of forward looking with this artwork on the cover. I don't know if somebody had a
very
crystal
COVID
ball.
Friendly.
Yeah, it's this PJ Crook lady that entered the scene and has done most of their artwork ever since then. I know people have sort of a love-hate relationship with her style. I like some of the pieces that she's done, and other ones I'm not particularly fond of. I'm not particularly fond of this one, but
so. Sean has sung this album's praises. I'm nonplussed, unexcited by the band at this stage. But also, we start hitting personnel tensions again. Because Gunn, at some point, leaves, although you wouldn't know it because I think there's some relationship where Gunn leaves but is employed as a session player before he actually disappears from the band.
Interesting. Does he leave and then come back for this album?
No, so I think he's on the album, but I think his last tour, he was with a different contractual arrangement. I think for his last tour, he was a session player. He wasn't financially a band member.
I didn't know that. All I remember is that right after the tour ended, there's an announcement that he's left. So we couldn't wait to let it be known that he was no longer in the band. But I had no knowledge of what you're saying, that he was a sort of a Rick Wright, Pink Floyd The Wall situation, touring as if still a member but being paid as a session. So I didn't know that.
So I never quite understood what was the cause of the tensions, why he separated from the band. Do you know?
Well, I mean, his main complaint was always that he'd never joined the band to be basically a bass player. And that's what he turned out to be once Levin was out of the band. And he thought it was too limiting to just basically play bass with his touch guitar. And I guess by that point also he had things, I mean, he was ready to go solo after being in Fripp's shadow for such a long time. And of course, he's been very creative and has put out a lot of music since in his own right. So it was probably a good decision.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that I mean, he initially put out a very large amount of music, some of which I thought was very exciting, and he did some other fun projects. He was like on the UKZ project with Eddie Jobson, which I thought was fantastic. Although he's been a lot less productive in recent years.
Well, he made a recent appearance at like King Crimson Camp, the Three of a Perfect Pair camp this year. And it looks like they did a little theater gig on the side while they were up that way, which was kind of nice to see. Trey back.
So you're saying Trey joined the other three for some music, or was just around?
He did, yeah. He was he was at the camp the whole time, and then they went and did a little gig there in town at a theater, and Trey sat in and played most everything. Yeah.
That's very nice. I mean, that's something that I wish was possible in the King Crimson universe, is that a past member could join for an encore or something. You know, I went to see them in Germany 3 years ago, and my dream was that they would have Mark Charig join them for the gig and play 3 songs that were in the set list: the Lizard, Circus, Islands, and Fallen Angel. That's something I could clearly see happening. David Cross joining them for a number, and I wish that such spontaneous get-togethers were possible. But it seems the concept of King Crimson is too rigid to accommodate such
spontaneity.
things.
Yeah, well, in hindsight, I think this is the better of the two albums. I just think because of the contour of it, you got a great ballad, "Eyes Wide Open," which I think is one of Blues' best ballads. And then we revisit Mars by way of something called "Dangerous Curves." The typical thing where you have one staccato note that rises up out of nowhere and becomes a loud, cacophonous thing by the time it's over. So in a way, it kind of brings things full circle.
Yeah, and it's not the only aspect that recalls Poseidon, because the Power to Believe bits are a bit like the peace songs on the Poseidon.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah.
I think Baloo should do a solo album called Baloo's Best Ballads.
There you go. Yeah, okay, do it, Adrian. You've got enough to fill it up easily. So yeah, and I thought this tour was a little more satisfying than the first one. I just felt like this lineup had gelled a lot in the past 2 or 3 years, and the use of more real drum sounds, I think, helped a lot too.
And also at this point, should point out that it was a really forward-looking lineup, because by 2003 they were playing very, very little old material, even 90s material, and that was quite a dramatic change when they did the subsequent tours, where it was all old material again.
Yeah.
So at that point, they were really playing the new music. The last two albums.
I mean, they did a few things. They did Red occasionally, but I never thought they did it very well. Honestly, I never thought it clicked with this lineup the way it did with the double trio.
Yeah, but I seem to remember there's a DVD of that tour, and maybe there's like 3 of a Perfect Pair as an encore or something, but it's mostly
stuff from these 2 records, and maybe a little bit of Thrack. I think I remember seeing that lineup play Vroom a few times, and Dinosaur, of course, was always in the set. But it was an enjoyable era, I think. But I felt like it kind of did everything it possibly could do. And I thought the 2-guitar cyborg kind of heavy approach had run its course. I was kind of craving some natural timbres. I remember posting on a rather well-known progressive rock website about how bring back the woodwinds. And what do you know?
How prophetic.
That's what happened. And I don't believe for a minute that it was because of my comment, but what do you know? It happened. And out of that, well.
So.
Yeah, talk a bit about this lineup dissolving and what happens next.
So Gunn leaves and Levin is available and comes back.
Oh, that's right. And they do a little tour, don't they?
No, they do a couple of sessions, working sessions in 2004, but apparently that doesn't continue because a tour manager passes away. That's something we learned recently. It seems to have been the reason why there was no further activity by the lineup with Levin back in the fold. But they do some new music. An album from those sessions was sort of hinted at in one of the recent tour boxes. They had a couple of tracks from those 2004 sessions, but it hasn't materialized yet. And so the next thing is, apart from a couple of a few gigs by Fripp and Baloo as Project 6, I think, opening for Porcupine Tree in 2006. The next thing is really the pre-40th anniversary tour of 2008 with Gavin Harrison joining on second drums.
You mean like this lineup?
That's the lineup that toured in 2008. So, Sean, did you see them? They toured only the US.
No, they only played like New York, and I wasn't inclined to fly to New York.
And Chicago and a couple of other places.
Yeah, I have some friends that saw it, and they thought it was pretty good. But I understand that there were some kind of weird tensions going on at that point. Am I right?
I think the tensions really were the next year when they tried to, as I said, this was a pre-anniversary tour, and the anniversary tour of 2009 never materialized because of a misunderstanding between Fripp and Baloo about when the touring would be, and Bellew had booked some solo tour in that period, and Fripp saw that as a sign that it wasn't meant to be and canceled the whole thing. There's a few recordings of that tour, and it's a really, I mean, it's clearly an anniversary tour, but only in a sense that it brings back a lot of 80s material, but nothing new from the 70s. It's the same.
It's more of the...
So it's not a very interesting set list. Only the most interesting thing about it is Levin playing on some of the stuff that was done without him, on the like Construction of Light.
Yeah.
And you can see that he's struggling a bit, because Gunn is an incredible virtuoso. Levin, of course, is a fantastic musician, but in terms of pure chops, Gunn is a bit above him. So he's struggling a bit with that material. But other than that, it's not a terribly interesting set list, I think, and it's not a terribly great ending to the Adrian's association with the band.
It is a nostalgia tour for a nostalgic audience. But one thing that is interesting is this decision to have a second drummer, which obviously King Crimson had at periods. Mastelotto and Bruford, obviously Bruford and Muir. But I remember at the time, a lot of people felt, well, why do we need a second drummer? The band had been touring with just Mastelotto before this. Gavin Harrison had been in Porcupine Tree, is a great player. But was he needed?
Well, the interesting thing is that he was sort of involved in the double trio as a theorist.
That's what I was going to point out.
Yeah, some of his work as a theoretician of the drums and polyrhythms and stuff was he had books out, right, that Bruford and Mastelotto were reading, and was very influential on the polyrhythmic stuff in the double trio. So it only made sense that he would eventually join. Despite his young looks, it's been around since the early 80s on the scene. So he was quite an experienced musician at that point.
Oh yeah, and he's definitely the mastermind behind the 3-drummer approach that the lineup currently has and has used for the past 8 years.
Yeah.
And I would say that is the thing that's the forward-looking King Crimson-esque edge that this current lineup has, I think, is in the drum department. The way that the 3 drummers split up their parts and have this conversation where they almost finish each other's sentences.
Before we get to what is the worst King Crimson idea ever, should we talk about, haven't we missed 21st Century Schizoid Band? Which I
guess we should talk about them, because that really explains how this Jaksic became part of this particular...
I don't know if it does actually, but it's certainly part of the equation.
Yeah, there's certainly, I mean, I think Fripp brought him into the band in 2013 because he was intending to play a lot of older British era Crimson material, and it'd been witness to what Jacko was doing with that band in the early noughties, and thought he would be the right man to sing those old tunes that Bellew was never interested in singing.
21st Century Schizoid Band was this reunion of old King Crimson without Fripp. So Michael Giles was central to it, Ian MacDonald, Peter Giles was involved,
Mel
Collins, and then they had Michael Giles' son-in-law as their lead singer and guitarist, a certain Chaco Jaksic, who is more than Michael Giles' son-in-law. He's a very interesting musician in his own right. He'd done a lot of work with people in the Canterbury scene. He'd been in Level 42. And in fact, generally, I prefer his work in the Canterbury scene to his more recent work with Fripp. But yes, they put together this band of mostly old King Crimson associated people plus Jacko. Toured, fantastic tour, I thought, mostly playing the old material. I think they had one Jacko original, maybe a McDonald original.
I remember
well,
they
played
Ashes.
Yeah, so they played that Jacko instrumental that later popped up on his Bruce Romantically Club album. And they played one track from the McDonald album, Driver's Eyes of '99. They played stuff from the McDonald and Giles album, Tomorrow's People, and part of the Birdman suite. And the rest, as you said, was from the early albums. It was really a product of the failed reunion of the late '90s, when the first lineup failed to reform, and so Fripp and Lake wouldn't be part of it because neither wanted to be in the other's company. So McDonald and Giles carried on with the idea, and I think Jacko was already acquainted with Mel Collins, possibly. So that's how the
Mel Collins
gelled.
So many sessions.
Yeah. So
and I thought, I saw the tour with Michael Giles.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic to be able to see Michael Giles live. I think that was the best part of it for me. But then he left after that initial period and was replaced by his replacement, sort of, Ian Wallace.
Right.
Yeah.
I saw that lineup, and I was impressed. You know what I walked away thinking more than anything else is how many early Crimson songs were derived from the blues. There's a lot of what we call a 1-4-5 chord progression happening, and they're playing fancy riffs. Pictures of a City is a perfect example of this. And there's other ones in that era as well.
Ladies of the Road, obviously.
So yeah,
I remember seeing 21st Century Schizoid Band, and not long after seeing Steve Hackett and thinking, wow, you can tell Steve Hackett's a King Crimson fan.
Oh, well, he was writing some songs. Remember that song, The Mechanical Bride, from his album about To Watch the Storms? That was basically a rewrite of Schizoid Man.
Yeah, I think it reminded me how much that first King Crimson album had been influential on Hackett, on Yes as well, on the whole scene.
On everybody.
So yeah, 21st Century Schizoid Band, a very successful, for me, reinvention. But I don't know, I wondered whether the band wanted to go beyond that and did want to do more in the way of new material, but struggled to do so.
Yeah, I think it was financially a bit unsuccessful. I think they didn't make much money doing that. And Jacko at the time told me that there was a notion that they might do another tour with Guy Evans on drums, because Ian Wallace was busy with other stuff, and
Guy Evans, a Van de Graaff Generator fan.
That's right. That never happened, and the group pitted out really at this point.
Do you think that it sowed the seeds for the nostalgic Crimson we know so well of the past 10 years?
In a way it did, but I don't think it was a direct influence on Fripp's reasoning. It's still a bit mysterious to me why Fripp suddenly decided to go kind of nostalgia act, although he wouldn't claim to be. But that was in stark contradiction to when he said in 2010 that he was leaving the stage forever and sort of wouldn't play live anymore. So I was quite taken by surprise. It was sort of a dream come true for me, because I'd wished for a long time that saxophone would be back in the band and they would be playing some early material. So I was quite pleased with the way things turned out.
But I think we've missed important chronology. So we've had that nostalgic, not quite 40th anniversary tour. Then we start on a new path before we come back to the nostalgia. So we get another project, or a project with a small p that eventually gets labeled a Crimson project.
The Scarcity of Miracles.
In the form of Scarcity of Miracles,
Aha,
which
yes.
is credited to Jack Schick, Fripp, and Collins, although it's also got
Levin and Harrison
on it. So people at the time were like, is this it? Is this the new King Crimson? So we get this out. So but this is a slightly old album. I don't think it's a particularly successful album. I don't think it's. I think Jacko's done a lot better work. But it's Jacko and Fripp improvising, and then Collins knows Jacko and somehow gets involved, and it's like, hey, look, this would be great with some woodwind on it. So it then becomes Jacko, Fripp, and Collins, and then they recruit Levin and Harrison, who they know. Jacko had worked with Harrison previously, as well, to sort of retrofit a rhythm section on top of it. So it's a slightly backwards way of writing an album compared to many albums where you normally start recording the rhythm section. But you get this set of improvs that Jacko edits into songs with Collins added and then a rhythm section added. And it's called Scarcity Miracles. And late in the day, Fripp goes, yay, let's call this the Crimson Project, which obviously brings it a lot more public interest and commercial viability than it would have had otherwise. And then do they don't tour that?
No, that it came out in 2011, just after Fripp had said he wouldn't tour again, so there was no notion of them touring. But of course, then 2 years later, it formed the basis of the new live lineup.
So we then get this new King Crimson, which is kind of the Scarcity of Miracles band, plus this idea of having 3 drummers, which is obviously something we need to talk about, which is going to play King Crimson music, but then it's not a continuation of, it's not a new King Crimson developing what begins on the Scarcity of Miracles. It's a nostalgia King Crimson that is playing old King Crimson songs from across the entire back catalogue, a very fan-friendly thing to do, but also a complete turnaround from the days when King Crimson would avoid playing any old songs. They do play a bit of Scarcity of Miracles. They play 2 pieces from Scarcity of Miracles in their initial touring, but that's fairly quickly dropped. But we have this strange new King Crimson, and so central to this idea is 3 drummers, which me and Sean clearly disagree on the value of. Fripp has spent a lot of years moaning about drummers and how they're too noisy and sort of wanting to put them in boxes away from him, and suddenly turns around and he wants 3 drummers at the front of the stage doing interesting interlocked stuff. Which, I mean, I just find deeply boring. I mean, having interlocked multiple percussionists is a lovely idea, but it's hardly a new idea. This is, Blue Man Group has 3 people doing percussion. There's a really good album called by Pete Lockett's Network of Sparks featuring Bill Bruford, which is all multiple percussionists. Love it, really good stuff. Not what I think we've ever got particularly exciting triple drumming from this King Crimson, and I don't think it fits the other King Crimson music. I'm going to moan at length about this. This new lineup has been exceedingly popular, super fan friendly, rave reviews, and there are some lineup changes to be discussed along the way, and it is currently on tour, more or less, or has the tour finished now?
I think it's almost done.
And there is sort of talk of this being the final tour.
Certainly of the US.
Yes.
But I'm not sure it's likely that they'll tour elsewhere.
So we are possibly at the end of this new era of King Crimson that begins in 2013, I guess, and then starts touring in 2014. Sean, come back and tell me I'm wrong.
I don't know. I felt like this needed to happen when it happened. I felt like we needed to hear this old music live. So for that, I'm very grateful. 8 years on, I feel like it's played out and done everything it possibly can do. So I honestly think it's time to do something else or do nothing. But it was 8 years of really interesting live shows that let us see the old material reimagined, and I'm very thankful for that. I think that really needed to happen.
So my personal feeling about it is that it's sort of a double-edged sword. I think there's the part about Crimson reforming and playing old material, sort of being a nostalgia act, which is meant to be counterbalanced by the three-drummer approach, which is supposed to be this cutting-edge aspect of the new band that's sort of makes it not a nostalgia act. I don't think it succeeds in that way to counterbalance the nostalgia act aspect. I think it's a mostly backward-looking band, whatever Fripp says, and it's an excellent one, probably one of the best. In terms of the contribution of the three-drummer thing, I'm not too fond of the standalone pieces they're doing, which to me look like demonstrations of polyrhythms for the beginner, or that sort of beginner's guide to three-drum polyrhythms. So I'm not too interested in that. And as regards to the other material, I think sometimes they try to faithfully recreate the original arrangements, like when they're doing the Michael Giles arrangements of the really early material. They're doing very scrupulous recreations of every cymbal hit that Giles did. So that's quite interesting in a museum kind of approach, like recreating, like they do a very faithful recreation of the mellotron parts as well. So that's really great if you're a fan of the early music. That's very well done. Other times they're adding more of a new edge to existing material, much like Mel Collins is adding sax and flute to material that didn't have any originally. So some aspects of that are more interesting. But does it ultimately amount to something really groundbreaking? I'm not sure, but it's still a great live band, and I tremendously enjoyed the many times I saw them all over Europe over this time period, and particularly the 2018 tour, which had all the lizard stuff and the double keyboard thing with the late and the greatly missed Bill Rieflin doing some fantastic work on keyboards along with Jeremy Stacey.
Talk a bit about Bill. You know, I recall Bill was the replacement drummer in REM after their original drummer, Bill Berry, decided to retire.
Yeah.
And there was a project I remember where him and Peter Buck, the guitar player from REM, got together with Fripp. And I don't remember what it was called, but I can't help but think that that kind of sowed the seeds of this Bill being part of King Crimson down the road.
Well, even before that, they had this thing with Fripp and Gunn and him doing an album in the late 90s as well. So there was an even earlier connection. So yeah, a multi-instrumentalist, a great drummer in his own right, and a very interesting keyboard player. As I said, if you listen to what he was doing on those tracks, not only was he doing the original Mellotron arrangements really very accurately, but on tracks like Pictures of a City, where there was no Mellotron initially, he created those very Crimson-y arrangements for Mellotron that were not there and were really in the right spirit. And so he was a very interesting contributor to the band. Very subtle, very musical.
Right.
And of course, he was the drummer in the early. He was the third drummer in the early incarnation, and only in retrospect did we learn that he then left the band because he already had his health issues. And when he returned to the band, it was purely as a keyboard player because he didn't have the stamina anymore to play drums. But he, on that first tour, that the bit of touring that they did, it was really excellent. I remember him playing A Sailor's Tale as the main drummer, and yeah.
So the long-term replacement for him was Jeremy Stacey,
the chap with the bowler hat here.
So I feel responsible in a tiny way for this. I'm going to back up this claim. Many years ago, I accidentally helped trigger a reunion of The Sin. The band, Chris Squire and Peter Banks were first in before Yes. And there was a Sin reunion. And they ended up doing an album called Sindestructible with Chris Squire on it. And that had on it Gerard Johnson. Gerard had worked with Peter Banks on a number of projects, but was better known for his pop work. He worked with Saint Etienne for many years. And I think it was Gerard who brought the Stacey brothers, their twins, Paul and Jeremy, into Sindestructible. Because Paul and Jeremy are both big prog fans, but they weren't. No one, would know they were prog fans. Paul and Jeremy were known for doing rock and pop stuff. Jeremy Stacey's biggest gig at the time was probably in Noel Gallagher's post-Oasis band, High Flying Birds. And so it was Sindestructible that sort of was Jeremy Stacey's, I think, first prog album. And then after everyone in the Sin fell out with Steve Nardelli, they went on to other projects, and we had Chris Squire, Swiss Squire, a Christmas album, and Jeremy Stacey was on drums. And then Squacket Squire took some of the material that was going to be on this sort of post-Sindestructible album, which Paul Stacey was also meant to be involved in. Chris took some of that material to Squacket, and Jeremy Stacey's on the album. So I think this appears to have been Jeremy's route into becoming known as a prog drummer, which ends up fantastically for him with him joining King Crimson. And while I don't like the triple drum format, that's not anything against the drummers, all three of whom are fantastic players. I mean, some of my unhappiness with the modern King Crimson is because I feel they could do so much if they were allowed to be more than this nostalgia band. I feel I think they're good on some of the early material, the pre-73 material. Stuff like The Letters, I think they do well. But I just think the band sound very lackluster to me on the 72-4 material. This material that's meant to have such menace and tension just feels quite flat to me, and I wonder whether that's because the triple drum format sort of makes it hard for them to have the agility needed to make that music really work. And also, and something we've somewhat skated over is I don't think, much as I love Jacko as a musician, and I think he's great on the early King Crimson stuff, I don't find him a great fit for the Baloo material. And the thing we haven't talked about is Baloo has been dumped. This new King Crimson dumps Baloo against his will. Before Fripp put the band back together, Baloo had been had formed with Levin and Mastalotto what Fripp allowed to be called the Crimson Project. And so he was doing so they would do new material with the Adrian Belew Trio, Stickmen with Levin Mastelotto, and then they do a set of Crimson material as the Crimson Project, and that band was fantastic. I thought that was a really great band. It really
great tour with Marcus Reuter, who
yes
is the man who deserves to be in King Crimson more than anyone else, but probably
and of course Julie Slick as well.
Yeah, Julie's fantastic.
You know, and I thought they were doing the Blue material much better than the King Crimson band are doing the Blue material.
Well, Blue is the key to that, you know.
Yeah.
You know, they've done what they can to try and reimagine it, you know, by, you know, for instance, in Discipline, where Jocko basically sings the melody, which is fresh. I'll give it that.
Well, there was no way for him to do it other than sort of rewrite it for himself, because if he did it the Blue way, it would have been really embarrassing.
Yeah, and it's almost like, of all the pieces that are Blue-centric, I mean, that's close to the top of the pile. So
yeah, although it's not that big a part of the song, really. I mean,
true.
A lot of the song is the drum thing at the start, and then the riff and the guitar solos. So they could have done it instrumentally. That would have been conceivable. But going back to what Henry was saying about the Larks era material, I think, I mean, I like Tony Levin very, very much, but I think that material needs John Wetton's dirty rock and roll approach to the bass to really get that menacing thing that Henry was missing in it. And that's been my main gripe about it, perhaps along with that lineup's sort of clean, a bit too clean and professional. I mean, that's where the amount of chops and know-how can go against the rock and roll vibe that is needed to get that material across in a really, I mean, with the right energy, the right amount of dirtiness about it.
Fair enough. Yeah. So we saw the lineup grow to an 8-piece once Bill regained his health enough to come and play some keyboards.
So there was,
okay, sorry.
I would say there was another drummer.
There was one that was kind of in there in between, whose name escapes
me. It was a keyboard player. It was Chris Gibson, I think.
Yeah, I saw that lineup, and he held his own quite nicely, but he seems more like a footnote than anything else.
And then there was a suggestion of having Theo Travis in the band, which would have been very interesting.
True, for one hot minute, yeah.
Except he was only going to join as a keyboard player, not playing any sax, I don't think.
Yeah. Still interesting.
Yeah, he passed on that after about a week of consideration, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they did rehearse with him, and for some reason it didn't work out. But again, what Jeremy was doing may have seemed on the outside like just fairy dust with the Mellotron thing, but it was really subtle. And
he's an excellent keyboard player. I mean, just when they dusted off Cat Food, for a good example, he played it quite nicely.
But that's Jeremy playing the piano on that.
Jeremy, right? That's what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Great players. They haven't done a studio album. But they have done some new material.
Quite a bit.
That new material divides into sort of two sorts. There's the three drummers doing stuff, which is largely been left up to them. They're sort of writing and developing that material.
I think it's credited to Gavin though. When the credits appear,
it's Gavin more than the others.
Yeah.
But then there's also some new songs from Jacko and Fripp collaborating.
Yeah, Meltdown is probably the most notable one that I can remember.
Which haven't terribly impressed me, but as people may have noticed by now, I'm not terribly keen on this lineup, but maybe other people like them.
Henry, are you drowning in doublespeak lexicon?
What I think is interesting is, although they haven't done a new album, there has been a few of these pieces, and Jacko and Fripp seem to have actually written more material, but it hasn't surfaced in the band. Jacko has recently done a solo album, which includes two pieces, which he says were for King Crimson.
But Fripp said it would be great for your solo album. Fripp was said when
that's
he
his way of saying it's not really working with Crimson.
But it's recorded with most of King Crimson. I mean, some of it has most of King Crimson.
The last track is very Crimson-y and has Mel and Fripp,
Gavin,
a number of guys on it. And the album, most recent one, what is it called? It's escaping me now. The Trouble with Something? Ring any bells?
I can't remember.
Anyhow, it's really good. And if you're curious about what modern Crimson might sound like, this is probably as close as you're going to get. So,
and I think it's really interesting how you do see interviews with the other band members who several of them have more or less said, we'd love to do a studio album. We'd be really excited to, but Fripp is in charge and he doesn't want to.
Well, the latest news is they've been recording during the pandemic. So interviews recently, has been suggestion that they've been doing some recording. So that's changed quite recently. The latest news is that there might be a studio album coming, perhaps more likely than touring.
Well, I think that's the only answer to breaking this nostalgic malaise that has set in. Is a new album, you know.
I would be.
You can call it nostalgic malaise.
I mean, it's a nostalgic malaise from the band's perspective, but the audience want the old stuff.
Well,
so
they've had 8 years of it. It's time for something else.
Well, perhaps that's you saying that, but I guess the majority of people would want the old stuff mostly.
Well,
I mean, commercially, nostalgia sells. And although Fripp doesn't want to admit that, you know, DGM is based on churning out the back catalogue of King Crimson in ever more complicated compilations. You know, but I don't criticize Bob Fripp for being for making money off nostalgia, because that's what all bands of the same era do. I mean, all his peers pretty much take a similar approach to Underground, or other. Some play a bit more new music, some play a bit less new music, but nostalgia is what sells. The fact that Fripp wants to pretend it's not nostalgia is just Fripp's normal talent for rhetoric. But I wonder with this new material how much the rest of the band will get to contribute, because I think there are some fantastic musicians here. I mean, all of them have other exciting projects going on. You know, Mastalotto seems to release an album every month, more or less. All sorts of different things. But they're all really interesting. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, well, the future is so bright you've got to wear shades. Well, in closing, I guess we should just talk a bit about what Crimson has meant to us personally. You know, I feel like that music has made my life better, and I can't really put my finger on exactly how. I guess just opening my mind up to possibilities in a way that most rock bands don't do. You know, this forward-looking approach is inspiring to me as a musician and as a person. And I don't get that from Yes or some of these other groups. There are other things that make my life better thanks to Yes. And it's almost more of a cerebral thing that's kind of new agey, kind of, you know what I mean? You know John Anderson. You walk out of a good Yes show and you feel like you just went to some sort of new age church assembly of sorts. And that element is gone now, unfortunately. But that's a whole different story. Check out our series, our 4-part series on the history of Yes, in case you're curious.
Was it only 4 parts?
Only 4 parts, yeah, that's all. The first 2 are the most popular, but the other 2 are worth checking out as well. And speaking of that, we've had a chance to look at the King Crimson catalog. in 2 exciting episodes. And next, we will take a look at the wide variety of live albums, box sets, and other dissertations coming up here in the next month or two. We will get back together and do the final episode in this 3-part trilogy, which is all about King Crimson in the live setting. So be sure to tune in and join us for that. And anything else you gentlemen would like to share? Any parting thoughts on King Crimson and its impact on you?
Well, to follow what you said about your own experience, I would say that the reason I like King Crimson is for the wide range of emotions that I derive from the music. They have such a wide palette of styles, ranging from just beautiful ballads to some really intense, dissonant music, and I think that covers most of the range of music that I like listening within the same band. So it's a very complete listening experience, and I think it's quite satisfying in this respect. And I mean, there's plenty of bands that I would listen in a more one-dimensional way because I want to hear some, like as I said, a beautiful ballad. There are bands that make a lot of beautiful ballads, but don't make the heavy instrumentals. And King Crimson has all those things rolled into one, and as a record playing experience, it's that wide ranging, and as a live experience, it is as well. Certainly, the last few times I saw them, it had all this range of material over 2.5, 3 hours sometimes, and yeah, that's quite a fulfilling experience as a listener.
I'd like to point out the humorous aspect that crops up occasionally too. You know, from afar, this seems like a very serious group, but there's quite a bit of humor tucked in there from time to time as well. Henry, how about you?
King Crimson is one of my favorite prog rock bands. I do think of King Crimson as like a Yes or an ELP. Fripp is very keen to see the band as different, and I think the fandom often wants to see the band as different, and I think it's not different. It is a band that emerged from the same milieu, had obviously many of the same people involved at one time or another. What I like about King Crimson, and also what I like about some of my other favorite bands like Yes or Henry Cow, is that there are bands out there like, say, Jethro Tull, which is based around one person. You know, Jethro Tull is Ian Anderson and his music, and there's some great Jethro Tull albums. But with King Crimson, it is, or most of the time, has been an ensemble, and it hasn't just been Fripp who has had creative input. Wetton, Bruford, MacDonald and Giles in the early days, Lake obviously as well, Ballou very much so, Gunn, Mastelotto. It's had all of these great musicians in it, and today, you know, everyone in the lineup is a fantastic musician, all of whom have done other material well worth checking out. And there's this exciting interplay between an ensemble with all sorts of creative people in it, and yet also Fripp is still, or after the early years, the leader and has provided an artistic direction. I think that sometimes been more successful as artistic direction, and sometimes it's been less successful, but I think it's that combination of an ensemble of talent all bringing something to the table, but also a leader who has pushed a band in a particular direction. And you see that, say, with John Anderson has often had that role in Yes, where again it's an ensemble band, but it's John who's pushing them to do Close to the Edge and then do Tales of Topographic Oceans. And likewise, we have an ensemble, but Fripp has assembled the ensemble, and Fripp has given them an idea, as with discipline, Fripp has come up with a creative idea, and everyone's on with it. And that tension between leader and band, I think, has often made King Crimson such an interesting band to listen to, that it's diverse, it encompasses so many sort of different elements, but at best combines them very well.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for taking part in this continuing series, and I look forward to getting together here in the next month or two and looking at the live albums. And then after that, who knows? It would be great to do another series on another group. We'll just have to decide what's a good one that the three of us both can chime in equally on. So stay tuned, and please subscribe to our channel at YouTube. It's /Soul, SOAL Night Live. There's over 100 episodes to enjoy there, and there's more in the works. I've been taking a bit of a break while I come to grips with the new job I have, and it's going pretty well. So hopefully I can resume putting my schedule together. But honestly, it's been nice to take a little break after a year of pretty intense showings. So thank you all. Hope to see you again.
Thanks, Sean.
Soon.
Always a pleasure, gentlemen. And take care, and have a great fall as it's approaching. All right. Well, take care and come back and see us soon. All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.